Review on Likutei Sichos in Chelik Chov, volume 26. This is the third Sicha for the Parshas Pikutei. It's a Rashi Sicha. The Rebbe asks a very simple question in the Pasuk, and Rashi doesn't address it. It says that Moshe Rabbeinu dressed the Kohanim, he dressed them the kutonis, their shirts. What about all of the other garments? It doesn't say. Uh, in the previous psukim later on, there's always about all the begodim. The Kohen needed all the four begodim. So why only kutonis? And he brings down the Ramban, who says that it actually is just short, but the Rebbe does not accept the Ramban's interpretation. And the Rebbe is mechadish, a gewaldige, a chiddush nifla, beautiful chiddush, that there was actually a difference between the first 7 days of inauguration, in which the pasuk clearly states that Moshe Rabbeinu dressed them all the four begodim, but this pasuk is specifically talking about the eighth day, the Shmini Limiluyim, and the Rebbe explains that in inauguration itself, there's a difference between the first 7 days and the eighth day. There is sometimes you prepare, you educate, chinuch, that takes place before it actually happens. That was the 7 days of Miluim. The eighth day was actually, it happens. So at that point, they did not need Moshe Rabbeinu. They needed to do it themselves because on the eighth day, it was already the beginning and the Kohanim were already in charge. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu's role was limited to one area, to the level of Kotonis. And the Rebbe explains, but with regards to the Kohen Gadol, which the Pasuk says that he put on all of his garments, that's because the Kohen Gadol's impact from this day was a complete something which brought down the Eish Hashem, so it needed to be done by Moshe. We'll see the details in the Sikha, and we'll go step by step. Pikutei Gimel Aleph. So the Rebbe begins, Shen Geret Filmol. First, the Rebbe says, we already spoken many times, establishes the fact, either Rashi answers all difficulties that arise in the simple study of the Pasuk, or uh, if he doesn't, it means that it doesn't need an explanation, or he's addressed it. But here we don't see it addressed directly in the place where we have an issue. The Rebbe will explain. Shigeret filmo. We already spoken many times. As Rashi bipirusha ala Torah, that Rashi in his commentary on the Torah, stellt sich op und is mefarish, he stops and he explains, jeder Inyan in welchen es fällt wir, every aspect in which there is missing explanation, leut pshute shamikra, according to the simple meaning of the verse, Rashi will always stop and explain it. Und wie sie is move on davon, how do we see it? We can see this. Maybe if Rashi doesn't have an explanation, or maybe he doesn't have to address it at all, he ignores it. The Rebbe says no. You see, if Rashi has an issue, he says that I have an issue, I don't have an explanation. Und wie sie is moving davon was in the Erter, because this is understood, that in those places where Rashi hot nit kein hasboref an inyan in Pshuto Shel Mikra, in those, there's not that many, but there's a few places where Rashi does not have an explanation on a certain matter, how to explain this in the literal meaning of the verse. So what does Rashi do? He says, I don't know, or similar to that. So which means he doesn't ignore it. He says, I don't know, but Rashi has to, Rashi will stop at every aspect which may be difficult in the simple meaning of the pasuk. Und der Fahr, And therefore, b'shas es isfaran an inyan. So from this, what do we conclude? B'shas es isfaran an inyan. When there is an area which seems difficult according to the simple meaning of the verses, and Rashi does not caution it, doesn't answer that, he doesn't address it. So what are we to do with it? So we have to conclude one of the two. Then we have to say one of the two possibilities. Oder as al pipshute shel mikro is dos millechatchila kinkashenit. Either that in the study of the literal meaning of the verses, that to begin with is not really a question. So you got to figure out to see it's not a question. That's why Rashi didn't address it. Oder ados is musbar loy tafrid the compirush Rashi, or that this has actually been explained according to based on a previous commentary of Rashi and interpretation of Rashi beforehand, and therefore Rashi doesn't have to address it. So there cannot be an issue on the simple text of the pasuk that Rashi doesn't address. And if he doesn't address it, it means that it's either not a question or he's already addressed it before in a previous commentary. So here we have the issue with pasuk in Pikutei where it says that Moshe Rabbeinu dressed the Bnei Aaron, he dressed them the Kotonis, and it doesn't mention any of the other garments. So based on this, we need an explanation. The Parsha Seinu in our Parsha with the Torah that said the Proteus, where the Torah relates in detail. Dem Zman und Seder von Hakomas HaMishkan, the time and the order how the Mishkan was raised. The noch steht, and then it says in the pasuk, "V'kraftu es Aaron ve'es Bonov." You should bring close Aaron and his sons. Those are the Kohen Gadol and the sons the Kohanim. V'rachatzto isom b'mayim. You should bathe them in water, going to the mikveh. V'hilbashto es Aaron es bigdei hakodesh goymer, and Aaron dressed the holy garments, which would include all the 8 garments, Bigdei HaKodesh, those are his 8 garments. Then it says, as one of Takriv, Vilbashtoisom Kotonis, and his sons you should bring close, and you dress them the shirts. But what happens to the other 3 garments? They had the Michnasayim, the Avnit, and the Mikbayis, the hats, what happened to them? It doesn't say. So immediately the surprise that comes is the Bnei Aaron haben doch gehabt Arba Bigdei Kona. The sons of Aaron had 4 garments of Kona. Kisoines, the shirts, Ve'avneit, the belt, Umikbois, the hats, Umichnasayim, and pants. So why does it state here? Only dress them the kotonis. So that's an obvious question. I have a difficulty. And actually, furthermore, we see Beferish in the pasuk earlier that Moshe dressed them all garments to the Bnei Aaron. Nochbe. Frey and in Parshas Tetzaveh, earlier in the portion of Tetzaveh, wo the Torah der erzählt dem Seder von Chinuch HaKohanim in the Shiva Simei Meluim, in which the Torah relates to us the order, how the Kohanim were trained into their kahuna during the 7 days of inauguration, the Shiva Simei Meluim, the 7 days of training and education. State beferish, so it says very clearly, that's very specific. There's one of Takriv, bring his sons of Aaron, bring them close. This is commanding to Moshe Rabbeinu. V'hil bashtom, and dress them. Kutonos, dress them the shirts. V'chagarta oisom avneit, gird them with the belt gomer. v'chavashta lahem big boys, and put on uh, their hats and gaimer. So we see that in addition to the Ketonot, it's also about the Avnet and also about the Mikbois. Valderach Zavaited in Parshas Tzav, and similarly in Chumash Vayikra, in the portion of Tzav, was when der zählt, wie Moshe Rabbeinu hat Mekayim gewinnt dem Tzivu bepoil, where the Torah relates. This was the command to Moshe what he should do. But over there in the Parshas Tzav, the Torah tells us how Moshe Rabbeinu actually fulfilled in actuality. State over there it says, Bal Yalbishem Kutonis. He dressed them the shirts. Vayachgir Isom Amnit. He girded them with the belt. Vayachbash Lamig boys. And he put on their hats. Favos beparsha seinu. So how come in our parsha, wenn der Eibishter hat angesagt dem Seder und Zman von Akoma Sam Mishkan v'chinuch Aharon uvanav, here where Hashem is instructing the order and the time when we actually raise the Mishkan and the training of Aharon his son, state nor vilbashta oisom kotonis. How come it only says to dress them the kotonis? We see very clearly from the pasuk that Moshe dressed them the other garments as well. A very simple question. And Rashi doesn't address it. Thus is Ashayla in Pikutei shel Mikra. This is a question in the simple literal level of the studying of the verse. And we don't seem like Rashi should answer this question anywhere before. So how do we explain this? Why is he only putting on their Ketonot? And we know that that's not the case because we read the portion in earlier in Tetzaveh and in the portion of Tzav that Moshe Rabbeinu dressed them the other garments as well. And Rashi doesn't address. So we'll see. The Rebbe is going to say that this is taka different than in the other. This was Shmini Lamaluim, as we'll see later on in the answer. But right now, the Rebbe brings down the explanation of the Ramban. Ramban says that it just mentions one, it doesn't have to mention all of them. The Ramban based, the Ramban for Entfer the Shaila. The Ramban answers this question as Kotzar be'inyan levishas Aharon ubanav. He made it short, didn't articulate. He made it brief with regards to the garments of dressing of Aharon and his sons. So Omar, by Aharon, he says in a general way, Vilbashto as Aharon as Bigdei HaKodesh, the holy garments, you'll dress Aharon. So by Aharon, also there is no specification. The Choshen, the Tzitz, the Ephod, it doesn't say that Moshe Rabbeinu, it just says he dressed them the holy garments, says the Rambam. So it says briefly. Ubebonov Omar, and by his son, he also says, Vilbashtom Kotonis. Put him on the shirts, because he doesn't need to go into all the details. Kikvar Omar, because the Pasuk has already said, Tziva Hashem Oisoi Befrat B'Seidel V'Shosom. He already said, the Pasuk already said what Hashem commanded him in details, how he should put on the garments, and that he should dress them all in the order. This pasuk here is not coming to tell him how we should put it on or what exactly, but just to tell us when is the time to put it on. When does he dress them? Shatiya achar hakomas hamishkan kuloi. This should be after Moshe Rabbeinu, after we raised the entire Mishkan. That is when we dress the Kohanim. But it doesn't have to specify all the details of all the garments. Just telling you when this dressing takes place. So why mention Ketonos? Says the Ramban, the Iskir Ketonos, Shabahen Yaschil Halavisha. So why would he mention Ketonos? Because you start with the Ketonos, and therefore that's what the Pasuk mentions as the beginning. And that's why it only says Ketonos. That's the way that Ramban explains. So the Rebbe says that in Rashi we cannot answer this, that this is really how Rashi would also interpret. Because number one, Rashi should say something about it, just like the Ramban needed to say. So Rashi ignores it, doesn't say anything. Number two, the Rebbe says, instead of saying that he'll dress them the kutoines, he could have said their garments, just like he says by the Kohen Gadol, the garments, which includes everything. We could have said it as well. And the Rebbe will also say later on, take issue with the fact that the Ramban says that the kutoines is the very first. But let's look aside. Aber, let's be the next oyster. Aber men kann nicht sagen dem Biur leut Rashi. But we can't explain this explanation according to Rashi. Weil, Aleph. Number one, Kishem wie der Ramban sagt beferisch, od dem Entfer, just as the Ramban says very openly, this answer, that the Kutonis is only the beginning, so Rashi, who explains in more detail, for sure he should have said this very clearly. And not to rely that one would on his own come to this conclusion of this answer, that the Kotonis is only a sample, but he really put on everything. So the Rebbe says, just as the Ramban had to say it, and Rashi, who's more articulate than the Ramban, should have said this also. But number two, befrat, as das is nit kein glatter tirus. This is not a very smooth answer. This answer is not so smooth. Like the simple level, literal level of pasuk learning. Kishem v'benegei Aaron zog der pasuk v'hil bashtu es Aaron as big the hakodesh, just as it relates to Aaron. The pasuk also is brief, as the Ramban mentions. It says the pasuk v'hil bashtu es Aaron as big the hakodesh. You dress in the holy garments, which includes all garments. Which means all of the 8 garments. The pasuk could have said in a similar way by the sons of Aaron, bring out to clothe his sons and dress them their clothing. Instead of saying the rest are kotonis and mentioning a sample and meaning everything else, say put them on their garments, like, or similar to it, like it says by the Kohen God, like by Aaron. Was das wird sein derselbe Kitzur wie beim Socken Kotonis. That will be the same short as saying Kotonis. But the benefit, it will mean all clothes. Und wird aber Köhle sein, alle Dalet Godimslam. But it would include all 4 garments. So, if Rashi according to the Ramban's answer, that this is just a sample, it doesn't really fit so much because in literal level of the pasuk, the Torah could have said, if the Torah doesn't mean only the kotonis, the Torah means all the garments. Why didn't it use a similar lashon like it used by the Kohen Gadol? And it should have said by the Kohanim, the Bnei Aaron, dress them the garments, and that would include all the garments, same length as saying kotonis. But the Rebbe is actually going to take. So the Rebbe says that in Rashi we cannot learn like the Ramban, that kotonis is only a sample to keep it short, because if it's to keep it short, you should have said bigdehem, which would be just as short. And the fact that it just says kotonis is a problem. Why only the kotonis? And then the Rebbe brings out that this interpretation of the Ramban is not really fitting according to Rashi, because the Ramban says that the first garment, that why does the pasuk use the kotonis? Because that was the first garment. It seems because the michnasayim, the pants, they did on their own. That's the way the Ramban learns. But the Rebbe brings from Rashi that actually also the michnasayim was done by Moshe, and therefore the michnasayim, if we're just giving an example, it should be the michnasayim, not the kotonis. Let's look inside. Gimel. Nochbet. The etzem pirush Ramban. The interpretation itself of the Ramban, as hiskir kotonis shebehem yaschil halavisha. Now, why does he mention the kotonis? Because that's where he starts to dress them, is with this shirt, with the kotonis. Ken men nit zogun le'shitas Rashi. We cannot say this according to Rashi's view. Ubehagde, by introducing, das was der Ramban sagt, as bohen mit die kotonis yaschil halavisha. That the Ramban says that you start dressing with the shirts. That's the beginning. Afal P, even though was einer von the big de kahuna is michnasayim. One of the four garments of the kahuna is pants. Unbepashtus, and simply is doch die kutoines von oben verdeckt michnasayim. That shirt was a long shirt that covers the pants. Haben die Kohanim zum allem ersten angetan die michnasayim. First, they would put on their pants, al besore, that needs to be directly on the flesh. Und erst noch, and only afterwards, angetan the kotonis über the michnasayim. Then they put the shirt over the pants. Is those li shitose davke? This is according to the view of the Ramban, that even though they needed to first put on the pants, but still, what did Moshe Rabbeinu start with? Was with the shirts. The pants was not something that Moshe Rabbeinu did. Do Redman wegen dem Zivut zu Moshe, we're talking about what Moshe should dress up with. As Moshe darf onton arnubonov zeire big de kohuna, that Moshe needs to dress up the Aaron his son, the garment of kohuna. Benegeya the michnasayim halt the Ramban, and as far as the pants goes, is the view of the Ramban. Verzok bepeirush in Parshas Tetzaveh, as he says very clearly in the portion of Tetzaveh. As Moshe had nit angetan Aaron of the michnasayim, he didn't put on their pants. Not Aaron and Bonavim Zalein ongeton behatzneya. But Aaron and his sons, they put them on modestly in hiding, not in the open, in private, to put on their pants. They didn't do it. Moshe Rabbeinu putting them on. That's how the Ramban says before that they didn't do it. And that's why in the pasuk before we learned it says Vilbashto, it doesn't say the Michnasayim, because they put on their own Michnasayim. That's how the Ramban learns it. And that's the way, as the Rebbe says, was Hazoi is mashma l'choyre from Pshutish or Mikra in Parshas Tzitzaveh. This is also, as it would seem, like in the very simple meaning, that the pants they put on their own before, not Aaron. In Parshas Tzitzaveh stay der Tzivu, because it says the command, V'osu la'michnas ebad, the pasuk says, make for them these pants of linen, Gomer, es nochun posig vilbashta oisom as Aaron achicha v'ezbonov itoy. That says, after the pasuk says you should dress these garments to Aaron, your brother, and his sons, was the fun is mashma, from that it appears as the michnes sebad geyen nit arayin in dem tzivu vilbashta. They're not included in the command to dress them up. We didn't tell yet about the command to make those pants. So this is like a standalone. It's not, it wouldn't, when he tells you put them on their clothing, he hasn't told you anything about the pants yet. So you can't say when the Torah is telling him put them on that he's talking about the pants when we didn't mention pants yet. Again, we're talking about when the command is said. Later on, they were there at the time. He could technically put them on. The pants were around. But the Rebbe is saying, from the fact that when the pasuk says put them on their garments, and then after saying dress them, so the dressing does not refer to the pants. That's what seemed the Pshuta Shel Mikra. But the fun is mashma, from this it appears, as the Michne Sebad geyen nit arayin in dem tzivu vilbashto, that these pants of linen are not part of the command of dressing up. So that wasn't Moshe Rabbeinu's responsibility, because we didn't talk about pants before that. So the Ramban's point seems to fit in that that's not done by Moshe. Furthermore, that's one part, one proof. Nochmer, there's further evidence for this, for the Ramban will show, but Rashi disagrees with that, as we'll see. Nochmer, Sai in Parshas Tetzaveh, beim Tzivut zu Moshe. Both in the portion of Tetzaveh when Hashem is instructing Moshe. Wie mit welchen Seder zu Anton, how and what is the order that he's supposed to dress Aaron of Zeder begodim? How is he supposed to dress them their garment? Unsayin, that's in the Parshas Tzav is the instructions to Moshe how to do it, and in Parshas Tzav the Torah tells us how he did it, how it actually happened. For the Torah that said the Moshe mekayim them bepoil them tziva Hashem, where the Torah relates how Moshe actually fulfilled the command of Hashem. State Kinal Sif Aleph, it says before, as we mentioned before, in Sif Aleph, we quoted the pasuk. What does the pasuk psukim say there? As Moshe malbish gven dibnei Aaron, kutones avnes umigbois. There's no mention of pants over there. There's the shirts, the belt, and the hats without no pants. Aber the Michnasayim werden nicht der Mann. There's no mention of pants. Is there fun mashma? So what does it seem from this? As the Michnasayim of the Bnei Aaron allein ongeton, that the pants were dressed, the Bnei Aaron, they did it themselves. I don't know so, but the Bnei Aaron, we're talking about what he dressed them. He didn't dress them the pants. Und es hat nicht Gescheiches zu ein bisschen durch Moshe, that has no connection to being dressed by Moshe. So the Rebbe says in the pasuk, it seems like the Ramban claims, or Ramban says that the first thing that Aaron did, what Moshe did, was dressing them up with the shirts, because the pants they already did from before, and that's why the pasuk mentions over here the Ketonot. And the Rebbe says this has very strong uh, proof, a mashmos. It appears so, both from the place where the making of the pants are quoted, and after saying dress them, and also in the pasuk it doesn't say when the Torah says Moshe Rabbeinu how to dress them, and Hashem tells them how to do, and the way they dress them, there's no mention about pants. So it seems like the first thing that Moshe dressed them is like the Ramban says, he dressed them the shirts. That was first, because the pants they did on their own. But the Rebbe is going to argue, Rashi specifically says that Moshe Rabbeinu did dress them the pants. And if he did dress them the pants, so why would the Pasuk say here that he dressed them the kutonos? It's not the first thing. The first thing was the pants. Let's look inside. Rashi, Ober Bipirush ala Torah. Rashi, however, in his commentary on the Torah from Pasuk and Parshas Tetzaveh, in the Pasuk of Parshas, it says, "Vilbashta oisom es arin achicha." Dress them, your brother Aaron. Zog the Ferish says clearly, oisom ha'amurim be'arin choishen. He says those that are said by Aaron. What is it mean? Choishen umichnasayim haksuvim lamato bekulam. That when he's going to dress Aaron achicha, Rashi says that means, what is he dressing him? Those that are said by Aaron, the Choshen, he brings the numerator, and he says the pants. Haksumim lamata bekulam, which is written by all, by the Kohen and the Kohanim. Everybody has pants. Learn the Rashi, so Rashi learns, as Eich the Levish Zamich Shel Aaron is given to Moshe, that also the dressing of the pants of Aaron, who dressed it to him, was durch Moshe, Davke. And if this was done by Aaron, ukimuvon, as al derech zeb is negeya, the michnosayim shel bnei Aaron. So the same thing should be, even though this pasuk is talking about the pants of Aaron, but if Moshe dressed Aaron his pants, he should be dressing the pants of the Kohanim as well. So, notwithstanding the issue that we have with the Pshutish Shel Mikro, Rebbe addresses the orders over here, but the fact remains that according to Rashi, Moshe Rabbeinu dressed them the pants as well. Rashi says so clearly. He says so with regards to the pants of the Kohen Gadol, but it's understood the same thing is by the pants of the Kohanim. It's all included. So, if the Torah wants to say short over here, saying one garment, Torah should have said Michnasayim, not the Ketonot. Ken and B'meil and Nitfared for them Tiretz Haramban. So therefore, we cannot answer what the Ramban answers as Hiskir Ketonot Shebem Yaschal Levisha. The reason he starts with the Ketonot is because he starts the dressing with the Ketonot. Loit Rashi. We can't say that's according to Rashi. Loit Rashi is as follows: Halevisha de Moshe given, because according to Rashi, what was the first thing they dressed? That Moshe Rabbeinu dressed them? Given nit mit the Ketonot, not with the Michnasayim, it was with the pants. So if the Torah wanted to say the first thing, it should be the pants. The Ramban Taka learns the first thing that Moshe Rabbeinu did was the Ketonot, because the pants they did on their own. But Rashi himself, the Rebbe shows he dressed them also the pants, so that was first. So the question is, why does the pasuk just say that Moshe Rabbeinu dressed them the Ketonot? What about the other ones? And you can't say he just mentions the first one, because if the first one, that should be the Mechnasayim and not the pants. As the Rebbe will now continue to explain that this is actually different, and here literally it means he only put them on the shirts. He didn't do the other things, and this is not the same time that the pasuk is talking about before in Tzav and Tetzaveh, which was during the 7 days of inauguration. Here we're talking the Shminim Luim, as the Rebbe continues to explain. So the Rebbe said we can say the biur. Rashi doesn't explain why it says that he dressed them. Moshe dressed the Ketonot only because that's only what he dressed. Rashi is nicht mefarish favos dover nit der mont die andere gimel begodim. Rashi does not explain why we're not mentioning the other three garments. Nor blois Ketonot, and only thing that we're talking about here is the shirts. Weil Rashi nimmt on dem pirush poshut kipshute kimashmo. Rashi understands that the interpretation of the verse is literally as it appears, that he put them on the shirts. That's all what he did. As Moshe takon geton dibnei Aaron, that Moshe only dressed the sons of Aaron, blois the kutones, only the kutones, unit the andere gimul begotim, only the shirts and not the other three garments. Well, that's why the pasuk says kutones. But how could we possibly say that? It says beferish in the parshas Tetzaveh and in parshas Tzav that he put them on the other garments as well. That was on the 7 days of inauguration before, but not on the Shemini, not on the day that we're talking about over here in this parsha. Unaf al pivos in parshas Tetzaveh, and although that in the portion of Tetzaveh, Uvaiter in parshas Tzav, and later on in the portion of Tzav, stayed beferish kinal. Over there, it says very clearly, as we said before, as Moshe ongiton oich dem avnei to mikbois, that he also put them on the belt and the hats. That's in the pasuk. Unlike Shitas Rashi, as the Rebbe brought from Rashi before, hoterzei oich ongiton the miknosayim canal, that he also dressed them the pants, as the Rebbe spoke before from Rashi. So that's true. It says beferish. Is as Valdorten Retzich wegen dem Seder von the Shivas Yemei HaMiluyim. Over there, we're talking about the order of the 7 days of inauguration, the 7 days of dedication and training. Was da mutot Moshe angeton die Bnei Aaron alle dalet begodim. Then Moshe Rabbeinu dressed the Aaron's son all the garments. Mashenke beparsha seinu, as opposed to in our parsha. Retzich wegen dem Tzivu was Moshe darf tun. Here we're talking about the instruction, what Moshe needs to do when? By Yom HaChodesh HaRishon B'Echad LaChodesh. On the first month, Nisan, on the first day of the month. That's the Shmini Lamiluyim. Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Was Loit Rashi, according to Rashi, it does give der Shmini Lamiluyim. That was the 8th day of the inauguration. The 8th day of the training. The Shmini Lamiluyim at Moshe. Onkiton de Bnei Aaron blois the Ketonot Kitlakaman and Takem. On this 8th day of the inauguration, Moshe dressed the sons of Aaron only with the shirts, as the Rebbe will say later on. Okay, Posht. Now, when we're saying that Moshe Rabbeinu put them on the shirts, we're not trying to say that they only wore the shirts. Of course, they had to wear all garments. You're not allowed to serve in the Avodah in the Mishkan without the 4 garments. But we're talking about what did Moshe Rabbeinu dress them with? Only the shirts. The rest they dressed themselves. Okay, Pasha, this is obvious. For sure, the sons of Aaron on the 8th day of Meluyim getrogen alle dalet begod. They must have worn all four garments. As Rashi already explained, as hameshamish mechusar begodim is chayim misa, one who serves in the Mishkan. A kohen who serves and he doesn't have all lacking the four garments is liable for death, chayim misa. But here we're talking about, as we said before, what Moshe is supposed to do, not what they're supposed to wear. V'hil bashto, you shall dress them. Vos Moshe darf mas resign the bnei Aaron, that which Moshe needs to dress the bnei Aaron, ubenegeya der halbosha de Moshe, and as it relates to dressing up by Moshe, is b'shminim limeluyim hoter zegedaft ontom blois di kutonis. On the 8th day of inauguration, he only needed to put him on the shirts. As the pasuk says, that he should dress them to kutonis. Mashenkin the andere gimel begodim, as opposed to the other three garments, haben sie allein sich malbish, when they put it on themselves. How do we know this? But I had the pasuk the months in it. Pasuk doesn't mention that Moshe put them on. They need to have all four. So how did they get it on? They put it on themselves. So now, why is this such a difference? So we still have to understand. Why Taco? Here all of a sudden they're just putting on the shirts and all the garments were put on the 7 days before. The Shemini, the 7 days of inauguration, they put on all the shirts. Moshe had to dress them, and here only the Ketonot. We need to understand how gufa time boy. This itself needs reasoning. It needs still, Rashi needs to explain this. This is obvious, but this needs to be explained. What's the difference between the 7th day of inauguration? Was then Moshe Rabbeinu dressed them in all four garments. And the 8th day of Miluyim, when he'll bash the Oisam Marak Kotonis. Over there he puts them on only the Kotonis. What's the difference? And we have to figure out something which would be understood that Rashi doesn't have to explain it. We have to find such a simple explanation. It should be so simple to the extent because Rashi daf is going to taste Rashi has no need to articulate this, to explain this. It's something from that you can understand in your own. From the verses and Rashi's commentaries himself. So the Rebbe explains now that. So first of all, the Rebbe clarifies that Rashi doesn't explain anything. Why only the pasuk mentioned kotonis? Because that's all what he put him on, the kotonis, according to Rashi. But this was a different time than what we read in the Tzav and the Tzav, which was the first 7 days. He put on Moshe Rabbeinu all the four garments, and on Shmini Lamiluyim, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, he only put him on the kotonis. But why? So the Rebbe is going to explain now first by explaining what was the difference between the 7 days of inauguration, the 8th day. The first 7 days, everything needs to be done Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe was the Kohen then. He practiced, he did all the Avodah, so he had to do everything. But on the 8th day, it was already a combination between Moshe and them, and therefore, they can put on themselves and Moshe can put on. Only some of it has to be done by Moshe. Hey, wird man das verstehen, behegdim achilik, will understand this by introducing the difference was megefin zwischen Shmini lemeluyim legabe di shivas yimei hameluyim. The difference we find between the 8th day of inauguration as relative to the 7 days of Miluyim that preceded it. Afal piyas oich der yom hashmini. Even though they're also this eighth day, Yom HaKomas HaMishkan, the day that the Mishkan finally stood up, they raised it and it stayed, is an inyan fumiluim, so it's also considered being education, dedication, inauguration. It's still part of it. Rashi zogt kama pa'amim, as Rashi says several times. Was miluyim meint, Rashi zogt in Parshas Tetzaveh. What does miluyim mean? Rashi says in Parshas Tetzaveh, Loshen chinuchu. It's a language of education, dedication. They were training. So the eighth day was also part of that dedication, that training. And because it was also part of it, that's why Moshe Rabbeinu participated. He didn't just give it over to them. Part of it, Moshe Rabbeinu did also. The Fargefintman, the Rebbe adds in the brackets. That's why we find, Rashi zog b'Parshaseinu, as Rashi says in our Parsha, as oich b'yem hashmini at Moshe Rabbeinu makru given korbanos tzibur, also on the eighth day, which was already after the 7 days of inauguration, but still on the eighth day, Moshe also was offering the communal sacrifices. Similar to this, that Moshe Rabbeinu did the Korbanos Tzibur, not everything was given over to the Kohanim already yet. In their Seder HaAvodah, we find several changes in the order of the service for Yom HaKomas HaMishkan, on the day that the Mishkan was raised, on the Shtoidesh Nisan, Lagabidim Seder HaAvodah, Kavul relative to the order that was for further generations. So, which means it was still in the training session. It was not fully yet given over to the Kohanim as it was in the future generations. This is all pointing to the fact that Shmini is still miluyim, it's still chinuch, it's still education. Und Rashi Bavorentes need bepirushay. Rashi does not discuss this, give the answer, or question this in his commentary. How come Moshe Rabbeinu was doing the Korbanos Sibur on the eighth day, but he already trained them in 7 days? So what's this eighth day? Why is Moshe Rabbeinu? Rashi doesn't address it. For Vibaldas Yom HaKomas HaMishkan is an inyan fun miluyim v'chinuch. Since also the day of the Mishkan being raised is a matter of filling inauguration education, per statement bepashta, so it's simply understood. It's still part of it. As alle beisa yemat Moshe noch als, that on that day Moshe continued to do the Aveda, kishem ve'eret as giton the Aveda in the Shivas Yimei. He continued to do the Aveda as he did in the 7 days of inauguration. He continued because this is still part of the Miluim, it's still part of the chinuch, the dedication, the training. Beis is nit muchrach as the Seder b'yem zeh. They don't have to have it that the order of these days will sign in themselves and oifen is their Seder l'deidus, that this day should have the same order as the generations. Rashi doesn't have to also answer why is it done differently, because it's still part of the Miluim. The Rebbe is just pointing out that the eighth day was still part of the whole dedication, the Miluyim, the training, it was all part of it. So, notwithstanding that, it's not at the same level as the first 7 days. Von deswegen is do achiluk ikri tzavishon the minyan hamiluyim from the Shivas Yimei Miluyim and from Yom HaShmini. There is a major distinction between the training, the Miluyim, the inauguration of the 7 days that preceded the 7 days of the Miluyim, and Yom HaShmini, Vahiba Yom HaShmini, and the 8th day. It's different. B'negeya the Shivas Yimei Miluyim of Mashen Gelernt in Parshas Tetzaveh, as it relates to the 7 days of inauguration, we learned the portion of Tetzaveh as Allah avodas, all services darf getan werden durch Moshe Davke. Everything needs to be done only through Moshe, specific to Moshe. While Rashi is dort mefarish, as Rashi explains over there, nor Moshe hadamot gehabt den din Only Moshe Rabbeinu had the status, he had the law, he had the qualification. He was fully a kohen. So it was only Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu had to do everything. But when it comes to the day of inauguration, is done with Rashi's Mefarish B'Hemshech HaKsuvim. And so then, as Rashi explains in the follow-up of the verses, though, Rashi explains later on, over here, Hushvu Kulam L'Kuna, they were all equal to Kuna. He wasn't only Kohen. Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't the only Kohen. Aharon Ubonov Homshagat Adin Fu Kohanim B'Shleimus. That Aharon and his sons already had a status, a halacha, they were defined as Kohanim equally. Hushvu means that they were equal. The sons with Moshe Rabbeinu were equal. Was the Fargifin, and that's why we find as Aharon not makriv given kama korbanos bebayek, that Aharon offered several korbanos on that day because he was a kohen too already then. Similarly, the sons of Aharon, on the 8th day of inauguration, they did also kama avodas, several services that you need a kohen. B'detzelt in Parsha Shmini, as related in the Parsha Shmini. So, while it's also part of the inauguration, but it's different already. First 7 days was only Moshe Rabbeinu. Now we have all the Kohanim as well, Aharon and the sons. Was the Funish verstandig? That from this we understand as the Meluyim b'Shiva Yomim u'b'Shmini, that the dedication, the education, the training of the 7 days and the 8th day, there are 2 categories in education. So that's why we have the 7 days and we have the 8th day. The 7 days, everything had to be done by Moshe. He was the only kohen. The 8th day, they were equal. And they're still called training. What is this in between? And the Rebbe says in training, the Rebbe will explain now, in Nois Bov, there's 2 periods. There is the time before the obligation starts, and then once the obligation starts. That's still part of the dedication and the training on the job already. Once you started, they still need, and that is what Moshe Rabbeinu's role was on the 8th day. So the Rebbe can say, what is the explanation? In Inyan HaChinuch, Meloshen Regilus, when we talk about Chinuch, language of training, getting used to. There's 2 ways. Aleph, chinuch, when you have education, was mizmargil in azach, when you train somebody in a matter, before you are obligated, you train, which would be chinuch cotton, like training a minor. He's not obligated yet, but you're training him what to do, but it's not obligated yet. Was der chinuch is blois ahachona behechsher to them später dikunton. That's only a preparation and gets him fit to what he's going to do later on. Beis, but second level of chinuch is loshen haschola. It's not preparing before, but it's the beginning. When hoipton ton azach b'ter chiyuv, you're starting to do something as an obligation, but zum ersten Mal, but it's the very first time. Betles angerufen b'shem chinuch. It's called also Chinuch, al derech de minyan for Chanukas HaMizbeach. Similar to the dedication of the Mizbeach started to function. It's the first, it's the Chanukah, it's the Chinuch. Al derech ze is benegeh the Kahuna von Aharon. One of similarly is as it pertains to the Kahuna of Aharon and his son. B'shivas Yemei HaMiluyim, during the 7 days of inauguration, is Bazei given der Inyan von Chinuch. They had chinuch during the 7 days. Was kumt eider mivert, before you become, and to use Rashi's language, Loshan Rashi, muchzik boy, before you hold on in Yakuna. Medav ze erst machen par Kohanim. You still have to first make them into Kohanim. The 7 days are before, and they're not yet the Kohanim. As opposed to the Eidim Zayin, they Shein Given, they already became Gevorn, they became Kohanim. They were and they became Kohanim. Through the Shivas Yom Shalifnizeh, through the training of the 7 days that preceded it. Und der Chinuch, der Inyan HaChinuch b'yom zeh. So what is the training? What is the Chinuch? The dedication these days is Ascholas HaAvodah Shel Kahuna, the beginning of the service of Kahuna. So these are the two categories of the 7 days and the 8th day. And the Rebbe says in the brackets, the Mishkan Atzmei, the Mishkan itself went through this process like the Kohanim. The first 7 days was getting ready, stood up, and taken apart, and then it stood up on the 8th day. Mishkan Atzmei. Even though that also during the 7 days of the training, the Meluyim, they raised the Mishkan every day and day. Is as blows given an in Arai. It was only temporary. They raised them temporarily, but in Baby and that same day they took it apart. The Matorah the Fun is given. What was the goal, the purpose of the Mishkan, putting it together? Blois only, or if not only, or mainly. This was just an idea. It's dedication and preparation to the Shpetedika Hakoma, to the raising it later on. Und the far, and that's why, is in the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim, during the 7 days of training, fulfillment, Lo Sharsa B'Shechinah, there was no divine, did not rest in the Mishkan, because that was before the actual Shechinah came down. That was on the 8th day. While in the Shivas Yomim is noch nicht given the Metzias von a Mishkan B'Shleimus, because at that time during the 7 days the Mishkan wasn't in its complete form. The Metzias is given the Iker Atil for Chinuch Aharon Bonov. The existence, the Mishkan was just, this was part of the training. They built the Mishkan so we could train Aharon Bonov before the actual obligation. It was not really a Mishkan. But when it came to the 8th day of inauguration, is Yom HaKomas HaMishkan. That was the day when the Mishkan was raised. Sizdo der Mishkan. Then we have the Mishkan. So what is the training? What is the dedication? The Chinuch b'yom zeh is not a hechsher tzashpetetik ninyan. That's not just preparing for something else. Nor aschola b'poil, but something that you start actuality. So on the 8th day they began. It's part of it, but it's the beginning of it. Oh, so once we understand the distinction between the 7 days and the 8th day, then the first 7 days there wasn't really yet the obligation. They weren't really Kohanim. The only Kohen was Moshe. But on the 8th day it was already stood up. There was a Mishkan already, and the Kohanim became Kohanim. So now we understand Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have to do everything now, because they can do it themselves. Some things he did. Unlike previously, you had to do everything. There was nobody else. There was no other Kohen, nobody fit. Zayin, Alpizei is moving bepashtus. So based on this, it's understood very simply the chiluk zwischen the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim, the difference between the 7 days of inauguration, Shmini LeMiluim, and the 8th day of Miluim, B'negeya that halboshes big Bnei Aaron, as it pertains to their dressing up the garments of the sons of Aaron. Because when you needed to make them up through Kohanim, that needs to be done to Moshe Rabbeinu. But once they're Kohanim already, they can do some of it themselves. The Pe'ula von Chinuch aufmachen, Aharon the Bonov for Kohanim. That aspect, the act of dedication, Chinuch, training, to make up Aharon the Bonov, to make them for Kohanim, can getan werden bloß durch Moshe allein. That can only take place through Moshe himself. The pasuk is medayik. The pasuk specifies it. Ve'ato hakriv elecha. You bring close to you as Aharon Achicha, your brother Aharon Vezbonavita and his sons with him. B'toich b'nei Yisrael, from amongst the Lakanili, to become Kohanim for me. So that's, you have to do that. As v'chdei tzuarois nemen. in order to take them out from amongst the rest of the Jewish people. And to raise them to become the Kohanim lead to become Kohanim to Hashem. Muzay ve'ato hakri v'lecho. You bring to you. That's Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is a mekarev of tzverim Kohanim. Moshe Rabbeinu brings them close to become Kohanim. Was the far seinen alle Pule shel chinuch from the Shivas Yimei HaMiluim. That's why all acts of education, of training, of the 7 days of inauguration, Gilgiton geworden durch Moshe and Dafke, were done through Moshe. Because he's the only one that could do it. Bis as afila di tvila shel Aharon Bonov, even the immersion of Aharon Bonov is given durch him. He had to do it. You should bathe them in water. Well, either Aharon Bonov weren Kohanim, because before Aharon Bonov become Kohanim, isn't it shaykh? It's not fitting as his own allein keneton benegei azer kuhuna to weren Kohanim. They cannot do anything about their own kuhuna to become Kohanim. They should make themselves Kohanim. They're not Kohanim yet. And the Rebbe says that is also evidence to what the Rebbe argued before from Rashi. The Rebbe said Rashi says that Moshe Rabbeinu also put on the Michnasayim, unlike the Ramban. So the Rebbe says this itself is also the proof for Rashi that since they are not Kohanim yet, they can't put on their own Michnasayim. So that's why Moshe Rabbeinu had to put it on. That's how Rashi is evidence that Moshe Rabbeinu put it on. Although in the Psukim and everything was mashma l'chayra, no, but Rashi says so because that's the evidence, because they weren't Kohanim yet. Und das ist euch der Hechshrech bepshuta shel mikra. This is also what forces us in the simple text of the simple study of the Pasuk to learn, as Moshe Rabbeinu had angetan, that Moshe Rabbeinu is the one that dressed Aharon the Michnasayim, that he also dressed in the pants. Although in the Pasuk it's not mentioned, I said before in Siv Gimel. Warum wie bald die Michnasayim gehen rein in the Ches, Dalet being the Kohuna, in the 8 of the Kohen Gadol, and the 4 of the regular Kohen, they are garments of the Kohuna. These are 4 priestly garments. Who's going to dress them? So who has to dress garments of Kohuna? Inyan from Beloshan Rashi, Milu Yodom Chinuch. The way is to fill their hands. Dedication, as Rashi says, that needs to be done by Moshe Rabbeinu. He has to fill their hands. He has to train them. He has to do the Finyan Kuna for the idea of Kuna. So it can't be done by themselves. It needs to be done by Moshe. By Moshe. It needs to be done through Moshe. Was opposed to when it comes to the 8 days of inauguration. Then the Bnei Aaron seinen schon gewähnt Kohanim, they were already Kohanim. Ist schon nicht muchrich, as the Vishis Abagodim soll sein durch Moshe. So then it's not necessary. So they don't have to have it through Moshe. They can allein unter the Begodim. They can put on their own God. They're Kohanim already. Punkt wie sie haben getan, Avodah B'Yisayim, just as they did other Avodah that day. Und das was achelik von Al-Boshe is bepoil given al dem Moshe. So why didn't they put on everything? Why does Moshe even have to put on the shirt, the Ketonot? No, those was achelik from the Al-Boshe is bepoil given al dem Moshe. Why a part of this dressing was through Moshe is mitzad them is because was zayndig der Tag von Chinuch b'hasholos ha'avodah shel Kohuna. Since this day was still, it was Chinuch, it was the beginning of the avodah of Kohuna. V'kihain li, v'kihanu li, when they actually served me, and they shall serve to me. Sheirus hakuna b'poil. This was the actually service of Kohuna. When avodah Kohuna is verbunden mit die Kohuna, and the service of Kohuna is associated with the garments of Kohuna, the riber is the erste halbosh of the shem avodah given durch Moshe. This was done the very first time. So therefore, the first time it was done through Moshe. So he did one thing, but why the Ketonot? Why not the Michnasayim? Why the Ketonot? Und der Fahr ist kein Kasche nicht, was Moshe hat angetan, die Bnei Adam bloß die Ketonot. It's not a question why he put him the Ketonot. Only the andere God, not the other God. Weil in der Halbosche ist nicht Muchrach, as Moshe soll anton alle Bite Kunishlem. In this dressing up, doesn't have to be in all of them. All their garments in that very first time that they're getting ready as Kohanim. Says genug was tutze on a beget kuhuna ikrishalem. The fact that he puts on a main garment, the kotonis, that's sufficient for that. So that's why, even though to accomplish the Mekaneli, the beginning of the Sheiros needs to be on Moshe, but doing one garment is sufficient for Moshe's involvement. Ula yesh loimar. So why the Ketonot? It's one of the main. But the Rebbe gives now, perhaps we can say that especially the garment, the Ketonot, why is it the main? Because the Michnasayim, the pants, Zayin and Blois, Lechasis B'sar Erva. The Pasuk says that is to cover up on their private parts. So it's to cover. That's not a part of service. It's for modesty. They need that. That Avnit is a toffel. So the Ketonot, the belt, is secondary to the shirt. Und the the hat is only on the head. This encompasses the entire body. Mashenkin, the Ketonot is a iker levush. It's a main garment. When a levush, welcher is malbish dem ganzen Guf, it's a garment that dresses up the whole body. Since, though it's still the Shmini Lemeluyim, it's not training which could be done by Moshe Rabbeinu, the Kohanim can do, but it's the beginning, and the beginning should be done. Moshe brings them V'chianu, so he brought, but he didn't need to do all the garments. He just did the Ketonot, which was perhaps the main garment, because the other ones had other purposes, or they only covered the head, and the gartel is only secondary to the Ketonot. That's why he did the Ketonot. But we have here one strong issue that still remains that the Rebbe addresses. So if Moshe participated only with one garment, when it came to the sons of Aharon, so how come by Aharon he dressed them all the garments? Because as fordert sich aber noch Biur, we still need to explain, was is the chiluk tzivishun Aharon ubanav? What's the difference between Aharon and his son? Was the Bnei Aharon, sons of Aharon, hat Moshe angetan nor die Ketonot, he put him on only the shorts. Mashenkin Aharon hat gedacht anton, but when it came to Aharon, he needed to dress him. Euch b'shmini meluyim, also on this 8th day of inauguration, alle Pikutei kodesh. He had to dress him up of all holy garments. It would seem like it's the other way, which makes sense. If the Bnei Aharon were able to put on their own garments, with the exception of the Ketonot, for sure, Aharon could dress up his holy garments. He didn't need Moshe Rabbeinu. I'm just thinking, I never bring in my own foolish svaras, but the Kohen's Godim were kind of difficult for the Kohen. You just needed another person to help him put it on. No. But the Rebbe explained the Shleimar, the Bir Bazeh. So the Rebbe says we can say the explanation, V'negeya avodas Aharon b'shmini l'meluyim, Zokt Rashi beParshas Shmini, as it relates to the service of Aharon on the 8th day of inauguration. So Rashi says in the portion of Shmini, when he served as korbanosoi v'avedosoi, that his korbanos and his service have oivgiton dem tisha Shechinah b'chem, that accomplished the resting of the Shechinah by you. Kumtois. So it turns out, ados is nit stam an avodah b'mishkan, the service in the Mishkan that he did, nor an avodah was it oivgemacht the shleimus v'ametzias for Mishkan. Shechanti b'soichan. This is a service that Aharon did that brought about the complete Shechanti b'soichan. And the riber, because of its importance, because of its crucial central part to making up the Shechanti b'soichan, the avodah of the Kohen Gadol on the 8th day, or the riber, or the ganze achone to the avodah, the entire preparation for this service, the albosha von alle bigdei kodesh, dressing him up with all the holy garments, gedarf sein durch Moshe, and needed to take place through Moshe. Was davke durch Moshe werd aufgemacht der Mishkan. It's specifically through Moshe that the Mishkan is made up. So here we needed Moshe himself to do it. This is Sichos Shabbos Parshas Pikutei, Tavshin Mem Aleph, and Shabbos Parshas Tisa Tavshin Mem Hey.